My parents threw me out of the house when I was just 16 years old because they said I was nothing but a burden. 18 years later, I quietly bought every house on their street, including theirs, and they had no idea the new owner standing in front of them was the daughter they abandoned. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Corrine Whitlock, and this happened in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. When I was little, life wasn't perfect, but I always believed my mother, Maris Whitlock, loved me. That changed after she married Denton Hale. From the day he moved into our house, everything slowly became different. At first, he acted polite around me, but that didn't last long. He found something to complain about almost every day. If a dish was left in the sink, it was my fault. If dinner was late, somehow I was blamed. If anything went wrong in the house, Denton made sure my mother believed I was responsible. After a while, she stopped asking for my side of the story. She simply accepted whatever he said. Living in that house became harder every month. I tried to stay quiet because I thought things would get better if I caused no trouble. Instead, it only made me easier to blame. My stepbrother, Lennox Hale, never had to worry about rules. He could break things, leave messes behind, and speak however he wanted without getting into trouble. If I made the smallest mistake, I was punished. Watching the difference between us hurt more than I can explain. I felt like a guest in the home where I had grown up. Every morning, I reminded myself that giving up was not an option. I still wanted to finish high school, even if I had to face every challenge alone. I found small jobs wherever I could. I cleaned tables at a diner before school, stocked shelves at a grocery store on weekends, and did yard work whenever someone needed help. The work was tiring, but every dollar mattered. I learned how to make a little money last for several days. There were times when I skipped meals so I could save enough for bus fare or school supplies. I never complained because I knew nobody was coming to rescue me. One afternoon after school, I went to the town library to stay warm and finish my homework. That was where I met Evelyn Mercer. She was an older woman with kind eyes who worked at the front desk. She noticed that I came to the library almost every day and stayed until closing time. Instead of asking questions that made me uncomfortable, she simply offered me a quiet place to study. Over time, she became the first person who truly listened without judging me. As we talked more, Evelyn learned that I wanted a better future. She believed in me even when I struggled to believe in myself. She helped me search for college scholarships and explained how to fill out applications correctly. She also introduced me to books about business, saving money, and making smart financial decisions. Many evenings, she sat with me and explained ideas that seemed confusing at first. She always told me that knowledge was something nobody could ever take away from me. One day she looked at me and said, "The best answer to betrayal is building a life they never expected you to have." Those words stayed with me. Whenever I felt tired or discouraged, I remembered them and kept moving forward. Around that time, I also started hearing things from distant relatives. They told me my mother and Denton were saying that I had run away because I was difficult and refused to follow rules. They acted as if they had done everything they could to help me. Many people in town believed their story because nobody asked for mine. Some neighbors who had once smiled at me now looked away when they saw me. It hurt to know my name had been ruined by lies, but I realized I couldn't waste my energy trying to change everyone's mind. I decided the only thing I could control was my future. Instead of fighting rumors, I focused on building a life that would speak louder than anything they had ever said about me. Graduation day felt different from what I had imagined as a child. There were no family members waiting to hug me or take pictures. Still, I smiled because I knew how much it had taken just to reach that moment. A few weeks later, I received the letter I had been hoping for. I had earned a scholarship that covered most of my college expenses. It was not enough to pay for everything, so I continued working while attending classes. My days were busy from morning until late at night, but I refused to complain. Every step forward reminded me that I was creating a future with my own hands. During my first year of college, I became interested in real estate development and finance. At first, I chose those classes because they sounded practical, but the more I learned, the more I enjoyed them. I realized that many old neighborhoods were ignored because people only saw their problems. I started looking beyond broken buildings and empty houses. I learned to recognize places that could become valuable again with careful planning and hard work. My professors noticed that I paid close attention to details that many students missed. That gave me even more confidence to keep learning. I spent hours studying property values, construction costs, and investment strategies. Whenever I had free time, I visited different neighborhoods and observed how small improvements could completely change an area. After college, I saved every extra dollar I earned. It took years before I could finally buy my first small rental property. The building needed a lot of repairs, and many people told me it was a bad investment. Instead of giving up, I worked alongside contractors, learned how renovations were done, and made careful decisions with every expense. When the work was finished, the property looked completely different. Soon, reliable tenants moved in, and for the first time, I saw my efforts turning into real success. I repeated the same process with another small property, and then another. Nothing happened overnight. Some projects were delayed, and unexpected repairs often cost more than I planned. Even during difficult times, I stayed patient because I understood that lasting success came from steady progress. Every completed renovation gave me more experience and opened the door to the next opportunity. Although my life was improving, I never forgot where my journey had started. Certain moments brought back memories I could never erase. Standing alone outside a house at night, hearing a door slam, or feeling cold winter air against my face reminded me of the evening everything had changed. Those memories no longer made me feel weak. They reminded me why I worked so hard and why I refused to quit when life became difficult. I chose not to let bitterness control my future because I knew it would only hold me back. Instead, I used my past as motivation to keep moving forward. I wasn't trying to prove my worth to the people who had rejected me anymore. I was building a life that finally proved it to myself. The years passed faster than I expected. One project led to another, and the small business I had started slowly grew into a respected real estate investment company. I hired people who believed in doing things the right way. We focused on improving older neighborhoods instead of tearing them down. We repaired homes, worked with local families, and made sure every property was treated with care. Because we kept our promises and dealt with people honestly, our company earned a strong reputation. Many sellers came to us because they trusted that we would be fair. I never forgot how important trust was because I knew what it felt like when someone broke it. As the company became more successful, I spent more time studying different towns and neighborhoods before making new investments. I always looked for places that others ignored. One afternoon, while reading through property reports, I noticed a familiar street name. At first, I thought it had to be a coincidence. Then I looked closer and realized it was the neighborhood where I had grown up. I hadn't been back there in many years. Curiosity made me continue reading. The reports showed that property values had been falling for quite some time. Several families had already moved away, and more homes were expected to be listed for sale soon. Many owners were getting older, while others simply wanted to leave the area behind. I decided to drive through the neighborhood without telling anyone why. As I slowly passed the streets, I barely recognized the place. The yards were no longer cared for the way they once had been. Some houses had broken fences, faded paint, and empty driveways. Stores that used to be busy were now closed. It was clear that the neighborhood had been struggling for years. Sitting in my car, I quietly looked around and remembered pieces of my childhood. I felt many emotions at once, but I kept my attention on the business opportunity in front of me. After returning to my office, I asked my legal team to begin contacting homeowners who had already listed their houses for sale. Everything was handled through my company, and my personal connection to the neighborhood remained private. Sellers only knew they were dealing with a professional real estate business interested in improving the area. One by one, agreements were reached and the purchases began. Every few months, another house became part of our growing portfolio. We immediately started repairs, making each home safe and attractive again before welcoming new families. The process continued quietly without attracting much attention. Nobody connected the company to the girl who had once lived on that street. As more properties changed hands, I watched the neighborhood slowly begin to improve. Deep inside, I knew this investment was different from every other project I had ever completed. This place held memories that could never disappear. And without saying a word to anyone, I kept moving forward one house at a time. Over the next few years, the purchases continued. Some homeowners contacted us directly after seeing the improvements made to nearby properties. Others were ready to move closer to family or start a new chapter somewhere else. Each transaction was handled carefully and professionally. Attorneys completed the paperwork, Property managers oversaw daily operations, and everything moved through normal business channels. There was never a reason for anyone to connect my name to what was happening on that street. As more houses became part of the company, the neighborhood slowly changed. Fresh paint replaced faded walls. Empty lots were cleaned and maintained. Families moved into homes that had once sat vacant for months. Children played outside again. Neighbors who had worried about the future of the area began to feel hopeful. Watching that transformation was rewarding, but it also brought back memories I had spent years trying to leave behind. Whenever business brought me nearby, I found myself driving through the area. I never stopped for long. Most of the time, I simply parked a short distance away and looked around. Certain places immediately pulled me back into the past. A corner where I used to wait for the school bus. A sidewalk where I had walked home carrying books after class. A small park where I once spent afternoons reading. The neighborhood had changed, but those memories remained. By then, our company owned most of the houses along the street. Only a handful remained under private ownership. One of those properties belonged to my mother and Denton. They still lived there, completely unaware of who stood behind the company that now controlled nearly everything around them. To them, the changes were probably just part of normal development. They had no reason to suspect anything else. Sometimes I wondered what they would think if they knew the truth. Would they be shocked? Embarrassed? Angry? For many years, I had imagined different versions of that moment. Yet now that it seemed possible, I wasn't sure how I felt. The anger that had once burned inside me was no longer as strong as it had been when I was younger. Time had changed many things. That didn't mean I had forgotten. The memories were still there. I remembered the loneliness, the fear, and the feeling of being abandoned by the people who should have protected me. Those experiences had shaped the person I became. Even after all my success, there were moments when those old wounds still hurt. As I looked at the street from a distance, a question stayed in my mind. For years, I had believed that reaching this point would finally close a painful chapter of my life. But standing there, I began to wonder whether revenge truly brought peace. Owning the street was something I never could have imagined as a teenager. Yet I still wasn't certain whether it would heal the part of me that had been broken so many years ago. Only time would answer that question. As our company continued working in the neighborhood, I started receiving detailed reports about the remaining properties. Most of the information was routine, but one file caught my attention. It showed that the house where my mother and Denton lived had several unpaid bills connected to it. At first, I thought it might be a mistake, so I asked my legal team to review the public records. Everything was accurate. The debts had been growing for years. Tax payments had fallen behind, loans had piled up, and there were repeated notices from creditors demanding payment. I quietly read every page without saying much. It was strange to see how different their lives had become. Through additional records and conversations with people involved in local property matters, I learned more about what had happened. Denton had made one poor financial decision after another. He borrowed money for investments that failed and ignored advice from people who knew better. Instead of fixing problems early, he kept believing the next deal would solve everything. It never did. Each mistake only made the situation worse until the family was buried under debt. I also learned something that hurt in a different way. My mother had spent years acting as though I had never been part of her life. Whenever someone mentioned me, she avoided the conversation or repeated the same story that I had chosen to leave because I was impossible to live with. She never admitted what really happened that winter night. Even after all those years, she refused to accept any responsibility for the choice she had made. Hearing that was painful, but it no longer surprised me. Some people find it easier to protect their pride than face the truth. Then there was Lennox. He was no longer the spoiled little boy I remembered. He had grown into an adult who expected everyone else to fix his problems. He changed jobs often, spent money carelessly, and depended on his parents whenever things went wrong. Instead of becoming responsible, he had carried his sense of entitlement into adulthood. The family that once believed he could do no wrong was now struggling to support him while barely managing their own problems. The situation was deeply ironic. Years ago, they had called me a burden and treated me like I was the reason everything went wrong. Now they relied on neighbors for small favors and faced constant pressure from creditors trying to collect unpaid debts. The people who had judged me so harshly could no longer manage their own lives. As I looked at everything that had happened, I felt something unexpected. I didn't feel the satisfaction I had imagined when I was younger. Instead, I realized that life had already handed them consequences far greater than anything I could have planned. Their choices had slowly created the future they were now living. Without my involvement, they had lost the stability they once took for granted. In that moment, I understood that time had already delivered its own form of justice long before I ever came back. A few months later, the moment I had wondered about for years finally arrived. The foreclosure process on my parents' house was completed. After everything was reviewed by my legal team, my company submitted the required offer and legally purchased the property. It was handled the same way we handled every other purchase. Every document was signed correctly. Every payment was made through official channels, and everything followed the law. When the sale was complete, there was only one step left. Someone needed to meet the occupants and explain what would happen next. I decided I would do it myself. I didn't tell anyone the real reason. I simply drove to the house one quiet afternoon. As I walked toward the front door, I felt calmer than I expected. For years, I had imagined this meeting with anger. Instead, I felt steady. I knocked on the door and waited. A few seconds later, the door slowly opened. My mother, Maris, looked at me without saying a word. At first, she seemed confused. Then her eyes widened as she realized who I was. The color drained from her face, and she stood completely still. Neither of us spoke for what felt like a very long time. 18 years had passed since we had last stood face to face. She looked older than I remembered. I knew I had changed, too. Finally, she whispered my name so quietly I could barely hear it. Before she could say anything else, Denton walked into the hallway to see who was at the door. The moment he looked at me, I saw the surprise on his face. He recognized me almost immediately, but he clearly didn't understand why I was standing there. I calmly introduced myself as the representative of the company that now owned the property. I handed him the official documents explaining the transfer and the next steps. He stared at the papers and then looked back at me several times as if he couldn't believe what he was reading. He asked if there had been some mistake. I simply told him there was no mistake. Everything had been completed legally, and the ownership had officially changed. As the conversation continued, both of them slowly realized something even bigger. Their house was not the only property my company owned. Nearly every house on the street now belonged to the same company. The street they had lived on for so many years was under my ownership. Neither of them could hide their shock. They looked around as though seeing the neighborhood differently for the first time. The daughter they had forced out with nothing but a backpack had returned as the owner of the place they once believed would always belong to them. I didn't raise my voice or speak with anger. I simply remained calm and professional while explaining the process. Standing there, I finally understood that the greatest surprise wasn't that I had come back. It was that neither of them had ever imagined I could build a life far beyond the limits they had placed on me. After the silence finally ended, my mother asked if we could sit down and talk. I agreed because I wanted answers more than an argument. We sat in the living room where I had once spent so much of my childhood. For a few moments, nobody knew what to say. Then Marissa slowly began speaking. She said she had been afraid all those years ago. She claimed she was trying to keep peace in the house and believed listening to Denton was the only way to avoid more conflict. She admitted that she had made mistakes, but she kept saying she had felt trapped and didn't know what else to do. I listened without interrupting her. When she finished, I looked at Denton. He showed no regret at all. He crossed his arms and said he still believed I had been a difficult teenager. According to him, everything that happened was my own fault. He insisted that if I had behaved differently, none of it would have happened. Not once did he say he was sorry. Not once did he admit he had treated me unfairly. His words didn't surprise me because they sounded exactly like the man I remembered. I took a slow breath before answering. I didn't raise my voice because there was no need. I calmly reminded them what really happened on that winter night. I told them I had begged them to believe me when I was accused of something I didn't do. I reminded my mother that she never asked a single question before choosing to believe someone else over her own daughter. I described what it felt like to stand outside with nowhere to go, wondering where I would sleep and whether I would be safe. I explained how every day afterward became a fight just to survive while trying to stay focused on school and build a future. There were times when I felt completely alone, but I kept going because stopping wasn't an option. Every challenge taught me something new about strength, responsibility, and determination. I never had the chance to depend on anyone because I learned very early that I had to depend on myself. As I spoke, neither of them interrupted me. My mother lowered her head and quietly wiped away tears. Even Denton stopped trying to defend himself. The room became very quiet. I wasn't trying to make them feel guilty. I simply wanted them to hear the truth they had ignored for 18 years. When I finished, I looked at both of them and said that everything I had achieved came from the decision they made that night. I would have gladly chosen a loving family instead of a hard life, but I never had that choice. Since I couldn't change the past, I chose to build a better future instead. At that moment, they finally understood something they had never expected. The frightened 16-year-old girl they had abandoned was gone. Standing before them was a woman who had become strong because she had been forced to face life alone, and nothing they said now could erase that truth. When our conversation ended, I stood up and gathered the documents I had brought with me. Legally, I had the right to begin the eviction process immediately. Everything was on my side. The house belonged to my company, and the law gave me that authority. Years ago, I probably would have used that power without thinking twice. But standing there, I realized I didn't want my story to end the same way theirs had. I looked at both of them and told them they would not be forced to leave that day. Instead, I gave them enough time to find another place to live. I also explained that my company would cover their basic moving expenses. Denton looked confused. He asked why I would help them after everything that had happened. I answered honestly. I said I wasn't doing it because they had earned my kindness. I was doing it because I refused to become someone who enjoyed making another person feel helpless. The choices they had made belonged to them. The choice I made belonged to me. Over the next several weeks, the moving process went forward peacefully. My company worked with professionals to make sure everything followed the agreement. There were no arguments, no public scenes, and no attempts to embarrass anyone. I wanted everything handled with respect because that was how I believed business should be done. During that time, people in the neighborhood slowly began asking questions. Many had noticed the changes taking place over the years, but very few knew who owned most of the street. Once my name became known, some older neighbors recognized it immediately. They remembered me as the quiet girl who had suddenly disappeared many years earlier. As conversation spread, the truth slowly came out. People learned that I had not run away as they had been told. They discovered that I had been forced out of my home and left to face life on my own. Several neighbors admitted they had believed the story my mother and Denton had repeated for years. Some even apologized for judging me without knowing the facts. Hearing those words brought an unexpected sense of peace. I had spent so much of my younger life wishing someone would believe me. Now I no longer needed to defend myself because the truth had finally reached the people who mattered. My success had done something I never could have achieved through arguments or anger. It had exposed every lie without me chasing revenge. As moving day arrived, I watched from a distance as the last boxes were loaded into a truck. I felt no happiness at seeing them leave, but I also felt no bitterness. Justice had come in a way I never expected. It wasn't about taking something away from them. It was about proving that the future they predicted for me had never become reality. They believed I would fail without them. Instead, I had built a life that stood stronger than every lie they had ever told. The day they finally left the street, I stood a little distance away and watched quietly. There was no scene, no argument, and no words left between us that needed to be said. They placed the last of their belongings into the car and drove away slowly. I didn't follow them with my eyes for long. I simply let them go. It didn't feel like victory in the way I once imagined it would. There was no rush of satisfaction or anger. Instead, there was a strange sense of completion, like a long chapter of my life had finally closed. I walked down the sidewalk after they left and looked around at the neighborhood. It no longer looked like the place I had grown up in. Over time, it had changed completely. With each property that was repaired and filled with new families, the street had slowly come back to life. What once felt broken and forgotten had turned into a place full of movement, safety, and hope. Children played outside again. Neighbors talked to each other, and the empty silence that used to define the area was gone. I thought about how everything had started with pain I never asked for. At one point, I believed I was losing everything that mattered. But over the years, that loss had become the reason I worked harder than I ever thought I could. It pushed me to build something bigger than myself. I didn't just want to improve buildings. I wanted to create something that could protect others from feeling the same loneliness I once felt. That idea became the foundation of every decision I made afterward. Instead of focusing on the past, I focused on what the future could look like for people who needed a second chance. My company began developing programs for affordable housing. We worked with local organizations to give homes to families who were struggling and young adults who had aged out of foster care without support. Every project carried the same goal. No child should feel like they have no place to go. Every finished home felt like another small step away from the life I had lived as a teenager. One afternoon, I returned to the same sidewalk where I had stood years ago with nothing but a backpack in my hands. I stood there quietly and looked at the house where everything had changed. I remembered the fear, the cold, and the feeling of being completely alone. But as I stood there now, I realized something important. My life had not been defined by that moment. It had been shaped by everything I chose to do after it. The success I had built was not just about business or money. It was about proving to myself that I could turn pain into something meaningful. I finally understood that the real victory was never about making anyone suffer. It was about building a life so strong and complete that the past no longer had control over my future. What would you do if the people who were supposed to protect you abandoned you?